Okay, so last talk in this session, we have Matthew Lickess from University of Reading. So he's an information designer in the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication. So again, something a little bit different. And he's going to be talking to us about exploratory work on presenting water moisture and crop yield forecasts for farmers. Off you go, Matthew.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen just being shared.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good morning. So as has been mentioned, I'm neither a scientist nor a geographer, and we're going to have a slight change in scene here because this work was carried out in rural northern Ghana, so somewhat different from the UK focus we've had in other talks, but I hope you'll find this interesting. And also, I should say, this isn't about NFM, it's in fact about the opposite, it's about agricultural drought. But it is all still about water and communicating to end users, people making a decision as a result of that. So this work was carried out as part of a NERC-funded project a few years ago. I was actually only really quite a small part of this work. I was a postdoc at the time. The project was run by Tristram Quaife here at the University of Reading. Really, this was looking at the use of remote sensing data and modelling to develop forecast systems for agricultural drought. As part of that, though, there's a really important communication challenge. If you have satellite data or advanced mathematical modelling, and your end user is somebody in a rural African village who has little to no concept of maybe how data is communicated through graphs, they might be experts at using their crops, experts in farming, but if the forecast product, the way you communicate it to them, isn't meaningful to them, it doesn't matter how good your forecast is, it won't be of use to the end user to make decisions. So there was a modelling, a science aspect to this. I was involved in a more minor way just at the communication end, and we conducted field work into villages in northwest Ghana. Before we get on to some of the exploration here, and really I'm not going to be showing one set outcome that absolutely works. In fact, I'm going to be showing you quite a lot of things that don't work, but it's in the spirit of exploration here. A key point, this is actually from some past unrelated research, but it draws on a point that we've heard mentioned a couple of times this morning. The way in which you present things changes what people understand as a result. So here we can see some data presented on some graphs. The same data are presented on these graphs, but they are presented in different ways. None of the graphs are incorrect, none of them are wrong, but people have different degrees of confidence, people make different decisions based on how you present things. This is, of course, sounds very elementary, but it's important to understand. You need to understand how the way in which you present some information will change what people think as a result, and therefore the actions they might take. So, onto the project itself. We were working with a very specific user group. We were attempting to communicate this relatively novel product, so a soil moisture forecast. And this is important if you're planting crops with, for example, quite a deep rooting depth. Even if there's not much moisture at the moment, there might be water available lower down. And this was an audience I didn't know anything about. So these farmers, I'd never worked with anybody in Africa before. And we were told various things at the start of the project about expectations we maybe should have and how that maybe differed from our expectations. So, for example, smartphone use was supposedly higher than we might anticipate. People were using WhatsApp, literacy and numeracy rates were higher than might be anticipated. This sounded very encouraging, and we had some ideas about how we might communicate in that situation. Then when we talked to the agricultural extension workers and the villagers, when I say agricultural extension workers, this was in fact going to be a form of mediated communication. So meteorologists in the UK might create the forecast, they would send it to extension workers in Ghana, who would then take it to the villagers. And these extension workers themselves were more familiar with graph conventions, but fair to say there were differing levels of scientific literacy within this audience. When we talked to the people, the stakeholders, it turned out that while they did have some smartphones, there were problems with getting data and signals. Some of the people who had smartphones couldn't read the messages that were sent to them, so they could receive a message but would then have to go to somebody else to have it read to them. And one of the key issues was that they didn't have familiarity with graphs, as I've mentioned briefly already. They were familiar with diagrams around safe sex, so communications from health aid workers, but the idea of communicating data in a graph was something that was new to this audience. And that, of course, again, creates a communication challenge compared to maybe what meteorologists in Europe might expect that they would communicate to a particular public. So we had to talk with people, we had to work with people, we designed a really wide range of ways to try to engage with this problem. I'm going to show you, what I'm showing you looks like a bit of a mess. That's because we explored a whole mess of things. I think I can zoom in. So we explored some things that were more like graphs. You might be thinking these are looking quite wordy for an audience with relatively low literacy rates. You'd be absolutely right. We explored some things we didn't think would work deliberately, as well as some things we thought would work. And again, remember that these communications were to be mediated by extension workers. So we explored some more traditional charts. We also explored very clear text glosses on these and thinking about what people actually wanted to know. So do they care about the data, or do they just want to know when the planting season is likely to start? We explored lots of different ways of doing that. We looked at using WhatsApp as a way of communicating data. It turned out that really wasn't relevant, despite what we had been led to believe. Just having things that were textual, having things that were visual, having things that were iconographic. Again, another really, so these are just rough drafts, but another very surprising thing that turned up as a result of actually working with people, discussing with them what would be useful, what they understood, rather than just giving them a product saying, what do you understand when you receive this, is that there was a distrust of standard weights and measures. These were something that the villagers and the farmers primarily used when dealing with outsiders, third parties, so for example, traders and buyers who would come in to purchase crops. There was a trust issue there because of the perception that they used false weights and measures, and that effectively if you were using kilos or pounds, you were being cheated, you were being shortchanged. What made sense in these villages were sacks and barrels and crates. This is, of course, not an exact measurement. It's not something that models forecast, but it is something that was meaningful to our end users. So if I'm teaching undergraduates at Reading, I'm always saying you must show the data, you must give context, you must explain various things. This was a context where various specifics of the data really weren't relevant to the end users. So we again, more exploration here. Other key things that we might sort of take for granted, but really needed exploring with these users. If you have a forecast, it's subject to a time and a date, but just using the set months of the year itself was also quite challenging. In these villages, there was a convention around naming or ordering months by first month, second month, third month. We thought we might be able to use that. It turned out, however, that what was the first month or the second month in one village was actually different in a different village. We ended up using set months of the year, using the agricultural extension workers to translate that for us. But there are some things like that it is very easy to assume are just known, and you really need to think about your users, talk to your users. In a UK context, there would be different things, but I would be inclined to say there are always things that you, as maybe a scientist or a geographer, assume that your audience understands, which is not necessarily the case. And so we moved to some more pictographic forms of representation. We came up with this idea working with the extension workers, and you'll see this working with the farmers a bit later, of using pictures of seeds. So the task that people need to do is to know when to plant a seed. So we were looking at using seeds as the way of encoding information. And the most successful outcome we came up with, and when I say we, this is collaborative, the materials we sent out, this is my colleague Henny and Celia testing things here. We didn't just send out pieces of paper or printouts or things on screens. These were laminated, and that meant that the people, if I can zoom in, the people to whom we were attempting to communicate with could put their own understandings, flags things that they understood, draw things on them. We found that they actually went and gathered seeds themselves. So we were communicating about planting. This was a successful idea. They would make piles and use different quantities of seeds to show certainty or uncertainty, amounts of good yield or bad yield. So this was something that related very much to the needs and the resources available. Oh, apologies for that. Get that back to 100%. So what I've just shown is a lot of stuff, really. The most successful outcome we came up with was somewhat like a weather forecast that the public in the UK might be familiar with, but with a bit of narrative and a staged way of showing it to users for the first time. Agricultural extension worker could do this. So we might, for example, have, this would be a long-range and inaccurate forecast, but some indication of what the rain pattern might be. This would be subject to a lot of uncertainty, obviously. We would then show an indication of what this might mean in the soil itself, using, other than just using centimetres for depth, using the tools and methods that were available for how these farmers would dig and interact with the soil. So, for example, using an agricultural machete or a spade or a pick or a hand to indicate depth. And I don't have all the stages here in this presentation, but you could move through the forecast here and you would see that the soil moisture would change as time progressed, and that the moisture would move, soil moisture would increase in the lower levels of the soil instead as it transfers from the higher levels of soil moisture. And this would then relate to planting choices. And again, you can use icons to represent plants. There are decisions around, do you use the seed? Do you use what the crop looks like at the end? The seeds are very different sizes, so showing this itself is quite challenging. And this was broadly quite successful. There were challenges in terms of what I might call user testing this with stakeholders, in that with some of the representations, there was a predisposition to certain members of the community to state that they liked some of the very complicated ways of showing this, but we found that they didn't actually understand them. So potentially there was a status element in showing that you were saying you were able to understand something quite complicated. We found that understanding was not actually the case. It was just desirable to say that you liked something that looked a certain way. But this sort of convention ended up being quite successful with our stakeholders. But it's just one way of exploring things, and this itself actually still has quite a number of problems.
Matthew, sorry to interrupt, just give you 1 minute warning. Thank you.
Okay, well, I was just going to stop there anyway. So really different, I think, in terms of some of the other things we've seen, not least because of the audience and the location. But maybe this is interesting to some of you as a different way of engaging or thinking about showing forecast information.
Great, thank you, Matthew. I do love a good infographic, a good pictorial representation. So it's really interesting to hear about how the process of actually deriving a useful graphic. Has anyone got any questions for Matthew? I've got a quick one. I'm always full of questions. Yeah, so like you said, that was quite a different environment and a different situation to what we're working with the NERC NFM program. I'm just wondering if you've got any experience of using these methods in a UK setting, or how they might be adaptable to what we're doing with flood risk management.
So these specific methods, no, but the more generalizable issues I think have been covered by other presenters already, and that's just the necessity of working with stakeholders, this idea of co-creation, and for the sort of things that I work on, really understanding what it is that somebody needs to do in relation to the data that you might be communicating. So rather than communicating your data because you've got it for the sake of it, thinking about the actions that people are attempting to do in their lives and what information would help them to take those actions.
Great, thank you. An excellent piece of advice. I think we're bang on time now, so thank you, Matthew. If anyone's got any questions, please put them in the chat. And